Hello, and welcome to this recording of a Coder Web training session, part of the ICD-10 Manual Mortality Coding Series funded by the CDC Foundation. This presentation is the second in a three-part module of mortality coding instructions for multiple causes based on ICD-10 Volume 2, Section 4.3. When recording the first session in this module, we thought all the material could be covered in 2 sessions. We have since realized that 3 sessions are needed to do so. My name is Patricia Wood, and I'll be instructor for this presentation. I work with the CDC Foundation as an ICD consultant. Although retired now, I worked at Statistics Canada, where I enjoyed a long career gaining extensive experience using both ICD-9 and ICD-10 for mortality classification. This presentation and others in the series are based on the WHO Mortality Classification Rules and Guidelines found in Chapter 4 of ICD-10 Volume 2. These rules and guidelines have been the subject of numerous updates over the years, and we use the 2016 version, which is readily available at the link on this slide. If, however, you use an older or newer version of Volume 2, please let us know. We'll be able to help you navigate any inconsistencies that may come up. The material included in this presentation is taken from Volume 2 with no supplementary examples included. And as usual, a separate and short coding exercise will be available to help you assess your understanding of the material covered. This slide illustrates the ICD-10 mortality classification process and is included as a refresher in all presentations in the Coder Web training series. The first pair of boxes remind us that the source document for cause of death coding is the medical certificate of cause of death. To promote comparability of the data produced in the coding process, the WHO recommends a standard format for the certificate. This recommendation can be found in Annex 7.1 in ICD-10 Volume 2. The second pair of boxes recalls that the first step in coding the information provided on a medical certificate of cause of death is to code each entity using ICD-10 Volumes 3, the index, and 1, the tabular list. And the third and final pair of boxes indicates that to accurately and consistently select the underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation, the WHO rules and guidelines for mortality classification, all found in Volume 2, Chapter 4, must be applied. All right, we're ready to start today's session. On this slide, you will see all the topics covered in Volume 2, Section 4.3, Coding Instructions for Mortality, Multiple Causes. The slightly faded print shows the material covered in the previous and other sessions. Today's material is highlighted. We will review the multiple cause coding instructions at subsection 4.3.4, Effect of Connecting Terms. The remaining topics will be covered in session 3 of this series. Just before exploring today's material, let's briefly review the introduction to the concept of multiple cause coding as presented in session 1. Looking at the slide, multiple cause coding is essential for a correct application of the ICD-10 instructions for selection and modification of the underlying cause of death. It may have been a while since you looked at the very basics of mortality classification process, but you know that in order to accurately apply the rules for selecting the underlying cause of death, you must apply an ICD-10 code number to each cause of death reported. This is necessary, for example, to use the international decision tables to determine the selection and modification steps applied, because relationships in the decision tables are represented by ICD-10 code numbers. Looking back at the slide, second bullet, multiple cause coding permits in-depth analysis of causes of death. For example, serious but avoidable complications of certain underlying causes and the impact of coexisting conditions on the outcome of a disease process. Therefore, ideally, for mortality statistics, both the single underlying cause and the multiple causes are tabulated. Besides enabling the classification process or the cause of death coding process, multiple cause codes can in fact enhance mortality data beyond the tabulation of a single underlying cause. Still doing a review of the introduction we covered in the last session. This slide tells us that to maximize opportunity for analysis, as much detail as possible should be retained in the multiple cause coding. On the slide, it goes on to say, such as the position of the individual codes in the data record should reflect where on the certificate the corresponding diagnostic expression or cause of death was entered by the certifier, because some analysis may focus on the terminal cause of death or on conditions reported in Part 2. Codes for common conditions or for conditions regarded as symptomatic or less informative should not be deleted or left out of your multiple cause data, since they may be of special interest in analysis of avoidable complications and may serve as markers of the seriousness of other conditions reported on the certificate. So, if it's possible to assemble and keep multiple cause codes, it would be ideal to keep as much information about them as possible. This will enhance the research that can be considered using all the information reported on the medical certificate of cause of death. And to conclude our review of the introduction to multiple cause coding, on this slide, it repeats the fact that the multiple cause data should be stored in two formats. One that shows as clearly as possible which term the certifier used on the certificate and where on the certificate each term was reported, and a second format that takes the stated or implied relationships between the reported conditions into consideration and where the codes have been harmonized according to the instructions in the ICD volumes. The recommendation to retain the information about each cause's location on the certificate allows for some standard multiple cause analysis, such as how often is the underlying cause reported alone on the lowest used line of Part 1, or how often a specific cause of death is reported in Part 1 as part of the sequence of events leading to death, versus how often it's reported in Part 2 as a contributing cause. Automated mortality classification systems such as IRIS or MMDS can automatically arrange multiple cause codes in each of these formats. Some manual intervention may be required in other mortality classification scenarios. Of course, this recommendation represents the ideal data storage system, but even a very basic retention of multiple cause codes can be useful in informing the mortality situation in a jurisdiction. As a basic cause of death coding principle, you likely learned to code each cause of death where reported on the medical certificate of cause of death form. This is solid advice, but sometimes a certifier will use a connecting term between two causes of death, and depending on the type of connecting term used, it may be necessary to move a code from one line to another to accurately reflect the intention of the certifier. Looking at the slide, we see what it says in Volume 2 at subsection 4.3.4, Effects of Connecting Terms. It says, when the certifier uses a connecting term, the codes assigned must be arranged to reflect the certifier's intention. There are two types of connecting terms: those implying a causal relationship between reported causes of death, and those not implying a causal relationship between reported causes of death. Let's move on and see how those terms might affect how we code. Before going any further, it's important to remember how relationships between causes of death are demonstrated on the medical certificate of cause of death as recommended by the WHO. On this slide is a snip of a medical certificate of cause of death as per the recommendation of the WHO. The instructions for certifiers are to enter in ascending order the causal sequence of events that led to the immediate or direct cause of death, with the underlying cause reported alone on the lowest used line of Part 1. This is because of the format of Part 1, where the words due to appear between lines A and B and C, etc. So if a cause of death is entered on line A and another cause of death is entered on line B, it is interpreted as A due to B. When the certifier enters two or more causes of death together on one line of Part 1, they are thought not to have a due to or causal relationship with each other. This is important to the application of the instructions on the effects of connecting terms. Here's our first instruction at subsection 4.3.4, effective connecting terms. The first type of connecting term being one that implies a causal relationship. A causal relationship may be expressed in two ways: due to, written in or implied by a similar term, or resulting in, written or implied by a similar term. Let's look at the slide at the first of these types of connecting terms that imply a causal relationship. Due to, written or implied by a similar term. Reading from the slide, when one cause is certified with a connecting term implying it is due to another cause, enter the code for the first cause on the line where reported and the code for the other cause on the next lower line. Code any causes reported on the remaining lines in Part 1 on the next lower lines. A small update was made in 2019 to include the sentence, "This applies to other connecting terms or signs that indicate a due-to relationship, such as caused by, because of, or similar." So here we see the effect that a connecting term such as due to, the effect that has on how we place our codes. Let's look at an example from Part 2. Example 1. In Part 1, on line A, we see the words heart failure due to ischemic heart disease. On line B, diabetes. Reading the explanation from Volume 2. Heart failure is the first cause reported on line A, and it is reported as due to ischemic heart disease. So code heart failure on line A and code ischemic heart disease on line B. Code diabetes, which was written on line B, on line C. In other words, rearranging the codes as described is the most accurate way to reflect the intention or opinion of the certifier in this case. Let's look at the next slide to see how this affects our coding. The certifier indicated in example 1 that, in his opinion, heart failure, the first condition on line A, was due to ischemic heart disease, the second condition on line A. The only way to show that causal relationship that he has implied using a connecting term, the only way to show that is to format the code so that the first condition appears to be due to the second condition, i.e., move the second condition down to the next lower line, in this case, line B. It's important to move the code for diabetes down to line C so that it remains as the first entry on the lowest used line of Part 1. So if you look at the slide, the codes are placed on lines A, B, and C in Part 1, respecting the opinion of the certifier, and we apply the selection step SP3 to get a tentative underlying cause of E149 as entered on the lowest used line of Part 1. There's a modification instruction at step M1 to combine that code when reported as a cause of I259 to yield a new tentative underlying cause of E146. There are no modifications after that, so our underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation from this certificate is E146 unspecified diabetes with other specified complications. If you're not familiar with the selection steps SP1 through SP8 and the modification steps M1 to M4, you can find helpful instruction in other Coder Web training modules on our YouTube channel. Here's another example of a connecting term implying a causal relationship, in this case, a term that means due to. Let's look. On the slide, in example 2, on line A, the certifier has written heart failure because of hepatocellular carcinoma. Because of implies a due to relationship. So the explanation tells us heart failure is the first cause reported on line A, and it's reported as due to hepatocellular carcinoma. So code heart failure on line A and code hepatocellular carcinoma on line B. Code ischemic heart disease, which was reported on line B, on line C, and code diabetes, which was reported on line C, on line D. Notice that the instruction is to code the second condition on line A down on line B so as to reflect the causal relationship implied by the certifier's use of the connecting term because of. The instruction goes on to say that the codes for causes of death originally reported on lines B and C should be moved down to lines C and D. Let's look at the next slide and see the effect this connecting term has on code placement and the selection of an underlying cause for statistical tabulation. Here's the same example with the causes of death removed and only the codes remaining. Here, the codes are formatted to reflect the certifier's use of a connecting term that implies a due-to relationship between the two causes of death reported together on a single line, in this case, line A. I think you can see that the code C220, hepatocellular carcinoma, see that if that were left in the second position on line A, it would not have been selected as the underlying cause of death, and that would not have been an accurate reflection of the intention of the certifier. So these instructions are all about formatting the codes to accurately reflect the opinion of the certifier. Let's look at another connecting term implying a causal relationship, but in this case, when resulting in, written or implied by a similar term. When one cause is certified with a connecting term implying it resulted in another cause, enter the code for the cause following the connecting term on the line where reported, and the code for the cause preceding the connecting term on the next lower line. Code any causes reported on the remaining lines in Part 1 on the next lower lines. This applies to other connecting terms or signs that indicate a resulting in relationship, such as causing, leading to, developing into, and similar. That's a lot of words for a simple concept. Format the codes to reflect the intention of the certifier. Let's look at an example. Example 3 in subsection 4.3.4, uppercase A, lowercase b, resulting in, written or implied by a similar term. In Part 1, on line A, we see ischemic heart disease resulting in heart failure. On line B, diabetes. The explanation says, code heart failure, which follows the connecting term resulting in, on line A. Code ischemic heart disease, which is reported before the connecting term, on line B. Move diabetes, reported on line B, down one line and coded on line C. It's exactly what the instructions said, and there you can see it applied. Let's look at the coding without the causes of death. So for example 3, after formatting the codes to represent the opinion or intention of the certifier, we have one code on each line. And this is very similar to an earlier example of the effect of a connecting term implying a causal relationship. But the instruction took account of the meaning of the specific term used. So we have our multiple cause codes. We would apply selection step SP3 to come to a tentative underlying cause of E149. Again, there is a special instruction at step M1 to combine E149, reported as the cause of I259, to E146. There are no further modifications, so that becomes our underlying cause for statistical tabulation, E146, unspecified diabetes mellitus with other specified complications. Another example of resulting in, written or implied by a similar term. In this case, on line A, we have hepatocellular carcinoma causing heart failure, with ischemic heart disease on line B and diabetes on line C. The certifier has used a connecting term that implies a causal relationship on line A. It's up to us to format the codes so as to reflect his intention. Reading the explanation on the slide from volume 2. Code heart failure, which follows the connecting term causing, on line A. Code hepatocellular carcinoma, which is reported before the connecting term, on line B. Code ischemic heart disease, reported on line B, on line C, and code diabetes, which is reported on line C, on line D. Let's have a look at that from the coding point of view. Here we have a single condition entered on each line of Part 1, the tentative underlying cause of C220, There are no further linkages or modifications, and the underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation is C220 liver cell carcinoma. So once again, this is what happens when we apply the selection and modification rules to this certificate, but we rearrange the codes so as to reflect the opinion of the certifier when he used a connecting term implying a causal relationship between the two conditions entered on line A. I think you can imagine if you didn't rearrange the codes, we would not come up with the accurate underlying cause of death for this certificate. We're ready to switch gears and look at connecting terms not implying a causal relationship. So as a reminder, we're in section 4.3, subsection 4, effects of connecting terms in ICD-10, volume 2, the 2016 version. And we're at uppercase B, connecting terms not implying a causal relationship. The first type is and, written or implied by a similar term, first or last on a line. Let me read this with you. The connecting term and does not imply a causal relationship, but it indicates that the terms before and after it both belong to an enumeration or a list. Therefore, when a line ends with and, code the cause or causes on the next lower line last on the upper line, so that the coding reflects the enumeration or list implied by the connecting term. Similarly, when a line in part 1 starts with and, consider this as a continuation of an enumeration or list starting on the line above, and code the cause or causes on that line last on the line above. Code any causes reported on remaining lines in part 1 where reported. One more instruction on the next slide. This applies to other connecting terms or signs that indicate an enumeration or list, but do not imply a causal relationship. Terms such as also, plus, besides, in addition to. Sometimes we see the little plus sign or even a comma. All right, let's look at an example where we can apply the instructions that we just read. So we are learning how to code for the effect of connecting terms not implying a causal relationship, specifically and written or implied by a similar term first or last on a line. Example 5 from volume 2. On line A, we see the cause of death, heart failure, and the connecting term and. Heart failure and. On line B, ischemic heart disease. On line C, diabetes. Reading the explanation provided in volume 1 and reproduced here on the slide, line A ends with and. So consider ischemic heart disease reported on line B as part of the enumeration or list, heart failure and ischemic heart disease. Code accordingly and place codes for both heart failure and ischemic heart disease on line A. Code diabetes were reported on line C. Here's example 5, reduced simply to code numbers. So we have I-509 and I-259 together on line A because the certifier used a connecting term that did not imply a causal relationship. So we code them together on the same line. And then diabetes reported on line C, coded on line C. We were moving it down before to keep it as the first condition entered on the lowest use line of part 1 when we were rearranging codes for connecting terms that implied due to. But in this case, we don't move it at all. It just stays where it is and we carry on. So here, go to select underlying cause. We'd apply step SP3, getting a tentative underlying cause of E149. Again, that same linkage, that special instruction at step M1 to combine those two codes to E146 as the underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation. Another example where and is written or implied by a similar term first or last on a line. In this case, on line A, we see heart failure. On line B, ischemic heart disease. On line C, and diabetes. Line C starts with and. Consider diabetes reported on line C as part of the enumeration or list, ischemic heart disease and diabetes. Code accordingly and place the codes for both ischemic heart disease and diabetes on line B. And here we see the codes arranged as per the instruction, as well as the selection of an underlying cause of death applying step SP3. No modification steps are applied to this case. And in fact, the underlying cause of death is selected for tabulation as I259, chronic ischemic heart disease unspecified. A slight variation, still working with connecting terms not implying a causal relationship, still thinking about the word and, written or implied by a similar term, but now not first or last on a line. If a connecting term that does not imply a causal relationship is written on a line, but not first or last, then treat as a comma. Do not reformat the text and do not move any part of the causes to another line. In this case, in other words, we're not moving our codes around. When the certifier uses the word and between two causes of death, neither at the beginning nor the end of the line, just this cause and that cause, we code them both on the same line together where reported. This is included as an effective connecting term, but it's not really exactly that, but it's an important thing that involves us formatting or placing codes so as to accurately reflect what the certifier is reporting. So it says on this slide, and if you're following along in volume 2, it's taken right from volume 2, at subsection 4.3.4, effective connecting terms, letter C, diagnostic terms that do not stop at the end of the line. If a diagnostic term or cause of death starts on one line in part 1 and continues on the next line, code as if the entire diagnostic term had been written on the line where the diagnostic term starts. Code any causes reported on remaining lines in part 1 where reported. This instruction may seem intuitive to experienced coders with a good understanding of medical terminology, but for newer coders, this can be quite helpful. Let's look at an example. Taken from Volume 2, Example 7. You'll notice the cause of death, ischemic heart disease, has been certified over 2 lines in Part 1. When typed, it looks a bit silly, but if you can imagine it in big, loopy handwriting, you may be able to imagine a long disease name taking more space than allowed on a single line. So the instruction provided in Volume 2 says, ischemic heart disease is a diagnostic term, or again, cause of death, reported on 2 lines. Code as if the complete term had been written on line A. Code diabetes type 2, where reported on line C. Again, no need to move the diabetes around. The worry here is that a coder with less experience may code ischemia as a cause of death on line A using I99 and unspecified heart disease, I509 on line B, which will result in a different underlying cause of death being selected. Let's look at how this is coded properly. Ischemic heart disease, although spread over 2 lines in the certificate, is coded to line A. Diabetes type 2, the code remains where reported on line C. Step SP3 is applied to select a tentative underlying cause of E11.9. There is a linkage, a special instruction for step M1 to combine those 2 particular codes in that format to a tentative underlying cause of E116. With no further modifications, the underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation is E116, type 2 diabetes mellitus with other specified complications. Again, imagining the certifier has run out of room on line B and continues writing on line C, and this time adds another cause of death connected only by a comma. Let's look at the example. On line A, pneumonia. On line B, chronic kidney. On line C, disease, comma, diabetes type 2. As the instruction on the slide says, both chronic kidney disease and diabetes end up being coded on line B. Let's read the explanation. Chronic kidney disease is a diagnostic term reported on 2 lines. Reformat the certificate and code the complete term, chronic kidney disease, on line B. Also code diabetes on line B since it continues the line where chronic kidney has been written. Okay, again, if you can just think that all these instructions are about how to position or format the codes to accurately reflect the intention of the certifier who has used a connecting term or has used more than one line for one single cause of death. Here we have the codes from the previous one and the process for selecting underlying cause, where we would apply step SP3 to select a tentative underlying cause of N18.9, and then step SP6 to combine that tentative underlying cause with the cause reported with it, the diabetes code, to yield a combination code of E112. And then there's a special instruction for step M1 that makes a further linkage for a tentative underlying cause of E117, which in fact becomes our underlying cause of death, E117 type 2 diabetes with multiple specified complications. Again, if you're not familiar with selection steps SP1 to SP8 and modification steps M1 to M4, you are invited to review the videos on our YouTube channel that deal with those particular instructions. It's critical that cause of death coders have a thorough understanding of the effect different connecting terms have on the placement or formatting of codes before the application of the selection and modification steps. Failure to accurately reflect with code placement the intention of the certifier could have an impact on the quality of the statistical tabulation of underlying cause. Just before finishing up, here's a short list of connecting terms that imply a causal or due to relationship as discussed at subsection 4.3.4, uppercase A, lowercase a. I won't read the terms to you, but there they are for your reference. And here is a short list of connecting terms that imply a causal relationship as the other one, resulting in, as well as a short list of connecting terms that do not imply a causal relationship as discussed at subsection 4.3.4b, A and B. This brings us to the end of this session, the second of 3, looking at ICD-10 Volume 2, Section 4.3, Coding Instructions for Mortality, Multiple Causes, specifically the effect of connecting terms. A short coding exercise to assess your understanding of this material is available. In Session 3, the instructions on sequelae and specific instructions on other ICD-10 categories will be presented. Until then, thanks for watching this video.